My own brother looked me in the eye at our parents' dinner table 3 weeks after I caught him and told the whole family I was misreading a hug. He managed to deliver that line with his wife of 12 years sitting 2 feet away from him and my wife sitting 2 feet away from me. 6 days later, both of those marriages were over, and I was the reason, and I have never once regretted it. But I need to back up, because none of that makes sense unless you understand what an ordinary Thursday looked like in my life before it stopped being ordinary. My name is Marcus Doyle. I'm 35 years old. I work as a project coordinator for a construction and engineering firm here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And up until the fall of last year, I would have told you my life was boring in the best possible way. Steady job, a house in Midtown with a view of the skyline, a wife, Christine, 33, who worked as a dental hygienist a few miles away. No kids yet. We were talking about it, actually, which is a detail that matters more than you'd think once you hear the rest of this. I have one sibling, my brother Adam. He's 45 months older than me, and for most of my life, he was the person I measured myself against without ever quite catching up. Adam got married first to a woman named Nicole, and they had 2 kids, Chloe, who was 9 that fall, and Max, who was 6. Adam managed the parts department for a regional equipment dealer, made good money, coached Max's flag football team on Saturdays, hosted Thanksgiving most years. On paper, he was the reliable one. The example. Growing up, Adam was the one who taught me how to throw a spiral, how to talk my way out of trouble with our mother, how to change the oil in my first car. When I met Christine at a mutual friend's graduation party, Adam was the first person in the family I introduced her to. At a summer barbecue in my parents' backyard near Fairview Park, I remember that afternoon clearly, even now. The smell of charcoal, my father manning the grill in an apron my mother had bought him as a joke years earlier, Adam handing Christine a lemonade and saying, with a grin I read as harmless at the time, "So you're the one who finally got my brother to settle down. I might have to fight him for you." Everyone laughed. Christine laughed too, a beat too late, glancing at me before she did. I laughed the loudest, because that's what you do when your older brother makes a joke like that in front of your new girlfriend. You laugh and you move on. And you never once imagine it wasn't entirely a joke. I didn't know it yet, but the version of my brother I'd built in my head had been fake for a long time. Longer than I could have guessed, sitting in my truck that Thursday. Here's the thing about that day. It started completely normal. Christine had texted me around 9 that morning saying her stomach was off, that she'd called in sick to the dental office, and that she was just going to rest. I offered to come home at lunch and check on her, bring her some ginger ale and crackers from the store by my office. She told me not to bother, that she just needed to sleep it off. Don't bother. I think about those 2 words more than almost anything else from that day, because they were the first real lie, even if I didn't clock them as one at the time. I went anyway, not because I suspected anything. I want to be completely honest about that, but because that's just who I was in that marriage. I liked taking care of her. I liked being the guy who showed up with crackers. I clocked out for lunch a little early, told my supervisor I'd be back within the hour, and drove the 15 minutes home. Our house sits on a quiet street off Fairview Boulevard, close enough to the park that you can hear kids on the playground equipment on a nice day. I remember it was unseasonably warm for late September, the kind of day where the leaves hadn't started turning yet, even though the calendar said they should have. On the drive over, I called Christine once, just to tell her I was swinging by. It went straight to voicemail. I didn't think anything of it. Figured she was asleep, phone on silent, exactly what you'd want a sick person doing at noon on a weekday. I stopped at the little grocery store on Peoria Avenue, picked up ginger ale, a sleeve of saltines, and, on impulse, the orange popsicles she liked when she was a kid, the ones her mother used to give her when she had a stomach bug. Small, dumb, caring gestures. The kind you don't think twice about until later, when you're forced to replay every one of them and ask yourself what you were actually walking into. I noticed Adam's truck before I noticed anything else. It was parked half a block down, not in front of the house. Parked the way you park when you don't want a vehicle to be the first thing someone sees. I didn't think a fair thought. My brain didn't even go there. I thought maybe he was dropping something off. Maybe he'd stopped to check on Christine the same way I had, because that's the kind of built-in trust you have for family before you have a reason not to. I let myself in the front door quietly, out of habit more than anything. I didn't want to wake her if she was actually resting. The house was too still, honestly, in a way I felt in my chest before my brain caught up to it. Something is wrong here. That was the first real thought I had, standing in my own front hallway with a grocery bag in my hand. I heard a sound from upstairs. Not a sound I can describe delicately, and not one I need to describe in detail either. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for maybe 3 full seconds, feeling the bag slip out of my fingers and hit the floor, cans rolling across the hardwood. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because I've had to sit with it for a lot longer than 3 seconds. My wife. My brother. In the bed, my wife and I had bought together 2 Christmases before. I'm not going to walk you through what I saw in graphic detail. You don't need that. And honestly, I don't need to relive it out loud. What I'll tell you is this. There was no misunderstanding to explain away. No innocent version of events. My brother's face when he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway is something I will remember until the day I die. It wasn't shock. It was something closer to relief, like some exhausting secret had finally been allowed to end. Christine kept repeating my name over and over, like saying it enough times could rewind the last 90 seconds. Adam didn't say anything at first. He just sat there half-dressed, staring at the carpet like it owed him an explanation. I didn't scream. I want to be honest about that too, because I think people expect this part of the story to be an explosion, and it wasn't. I felt strangely, terrifyingly calm. I picked my keys back up off the floor where I'd dropped them along with the grocery bag, and one sentence came out flat and even. Get dressed. Both of you. We're going to talk, and then you're going to decide how the rest of this plays out. I didn't know it yet, but that sentence, you're going to decide how the rest of this plays out, was the beginning of a plan I hadn't consciously made yet. Some part of my brain had already skipped past the shouting match version of this story and landed on something colder. Something that would eventually involve every single person in my family sitting at one table with nowhere to hide. Christine came downstairs first, wrapped in a robe, her face wrecked, mascara she hadn't been wearing an hour earlier, somehow smeared under her eyes from crying already. I realized, not from anything I'd done. Adam came down a few minutes after, moving slow, the way you move when you're trying to buy time you don't have. Marcus, he started. It's not. Don't. The word came out sharper than I meant it to. Don't finish that sentence. I watched what it was. Here's what I found out over the next 20 minutes, standing in my own kitchen, refusing to sit down because some part of me knew that sitting down would make this feel too normal. Too much like a conversation instead of an ending. This wasn't new. It wasn't a one-time mistake, a lapse, a moment of weakness. The kind of language people reach for when they want forgiveness cheap. Christine told me, through tears that I genuinely couldn't tell were guilt or fear of getting caught, that it had been going on for 2 years. 2 years. Quiet, careful, built entirely on the fact that nobody would ever suspect Adam, reliable Adam, family man Adam, of doing something like this to his own brother. And then she told me something that changed the entire shape of the story in my head. Adam, she admitted, had been interested in her since before we were even married. Since I first brought her around to meet the family 5 years earlier at a barbecue at my parents' place. He'd made comments back then. Small ones, deniable ones, the kind you can wave off as a brother being a little too familiar. And she'd brushed it off at the time because she loved me, and it didn't seem worth mentioning. 5 years. My brother had been circling my marriage since before it existed. I stood in that kitchen and felt something shift permanently in my understanding of my own family. Every Thanksgiving, every birthday, every time Adam had clapped me on the back and called me a lucky man for landing Christine. All of it recontextualized itself in about 4 seconds. I didn't know it yet, but the hardest part of that day wasn't the betrayal itself. It was realizing I was going to have to walk into my parents' house and detonate the version of our family that had existed my entire life, on purpose, with full knowledge of exactly what it would cost everyone in the room, including 2 kids who hadn't done a single thing wrong. I looked at both of them standing in my kitchen and let out the sentence that would set the next 3 weeks in motion. You're going to tell everyone. Mom, Dad, Nicole, all of it, the truth, not some cleaned-up version. This weekend at Sunday dinner, in front of the whole family. If you don't, I will, and you will not like the version I tell. Adam's face went pale in a way I'd never seen on him before. Marcus, think about the kids. Think about what that does to Chloe and Max. I remember laughing. Not a happy laugh. The kind that comes out when something is so unbelievable it physically has to leave your body somehow. You should have thought about your kids 2 years ago. Every single time you got in that bed. I walked out of my own house that afternoon, got back in my truck, and drove back to work like nothing had happened, because I genuinely did not know what else to do with my body for the next 4 hours. I sat through a client meeting about drainage specifications for a warehouse project, and I have no memory of a single word that was said. My supervisor, a good-natured guy named Carl Jennings, who'd worked with my father years ago on a supply contract, caught me afterward in the hallway, asking if I was feeling all right, that I looked like I'd seen a ghost. Raw morning was all I managed. I'll be fine. You sure? You can head out early if you need to. I nodded and waved him off, mostly because I didn't trust myself to explain any further without the whole thing spilling out in the middle of an office hallway. My hands didn't stop shaking until almost 6 o'clock that evening, sitting alone in my truck in the parking lot long after everyone else had gone home. Before I left the house that afternoon, there was one more moment I haven't mentioned. Standing in the driveway next to my truck, keys already in my hand, I almost called Nicole. My thumb actually hovered over her name in my phone for a few seconds. Some instinct told me she deserved to know immediately. Not in 3 days. Not at a staged dinner. Right then, while it was still raw enough that nobody could sand the edges off it. But another part of me, the part that was already thinking in terms of consequences and leverage instead of just pain, wanted every single person in that family to hear it at the same time, in the same room, with no chance for Adam and Christine to get their story straight beforehand. I put the phone back in my pocket. I've wondered since whether that was the right call. Nicole later told me it wouldn't have mattered either way. By the time that Sunday came, she said she'd already stopped being surprised by very much when it came to her marriage. I didn't know it yet, but that Sunday dinner was going to be the loudest 90 minutes of my entire life. And somebody in that room already had her own plan quietly forming, one I wouldn't find out about until much later. The 3 days between that Thursday and Sunday dinner were some of the strangest of my life. I moved my things into the guest room that same night. I couldn't be in that bedroom, not for one more hour, let alone sleep in it. Christine tried to talk to me twice. The first time was Friday evening. She knocked on the guest room door and stood in the hallway, arms crossed over herself like she was cold. Can we please just talk? Not about Sunday. Just us. What actually happens to us. There isn't an us to talk about anymore. There's what you and Adam did, and there's what happens once everyone else knows about it. That's it. The second time was Saturday morning over coffee she made, and I didn't ask for. She told me she never meant to fall in love with him. That phrase exactly. Fall in love. Like this had been some accident of the heart instead of 2 years of scheduled, deliberate choices. I remember setting my mug down harder than I meant to. You don't fall into someone's bed for 2 years, I told her. You choose it. Every single time you chose it. Don't call it falling. She didn't have a response to that. Both times I told her the same thing. Save whatever she needed to say for Sunday in front of everyone, or don't bother saving it at all. I called my father, Harold, 66 years old, retired after 30 years running his own small hardware supply business, and told him I needed the whole family together this weekend. I didn't tell him why. I just told him it was important, that Adam and Christine both needed to be there, and that Nicole needed to be there too. My mother, Carol, 64, picked up on something in my voice immediately. Mothers always do, and asked if everything was okay. I told her it would be, eventually. That was the most honest thing I could offer her at the time. I want to tell you a little more about how this actually started, because the shape of it matters. 5 years ago, when I first brought Christine around to meet my family, we were still dating. Nothing serious enough yet to call it anything official. Adam made a joke that weekend, the kind of joke you laugh off in the moment because calling it out would make you look insecure, something about how I'd gotten lucky and how he might have to fight me for her. Everyone laughed. I laughed. Christine laughed a little uncomfortably. And I remember noticing that discomfort and not asking about it, because why would I? He was my brother. Brothers say dumb things. That planted seed sat there for 3 years while Christine and I dated, got engaged, got married. And then 2 years ago, according to what Christine eventually admitted, it started small. Adam had helped her move some furniture while I was away for a work training out of state. A conversation that went a little too long. A comment that should have ended the conversation but didn't. From there, it built slowly, deliberately, in the spaces where I wasn't looking. My out-of-town work trips. The Saturday mornings Adam told his own wife he was running errands. Christine told me, in that same kitchen conversation, that the first time anything physical happened was at our own house. On a weekend I was in Denver for a training certification. She told herself, apparently, that it was a one-time lapse, something she'd carry quietly and never repeat. It didn't stay that way. Once something like that starts, I've come to understand, the lie doesn't stay contained to one afternoon. It needs constant, ongoing maintenance. Fake plans, real alibis for imaginary errands. Text messages deleted the moment they were read. 2 years of that running underneath every holiday, every birthday, Every ordinary weeknight dinner where I sat across the table from my own brother with absolutely no idea what I was actually looking at. I asked her once, that same day, why she never stopped it, why 2 years went by instead of 2 days. She didn't have a real answer. The closest thing she offered was that it felt easier to keep going than to face what stopping would mean, which I've realized since is probably the most honest sentence she managed that whole afternoon, even if it wasn't the answer I wanted. Nicole had no idea. I want to be completely clear about that, because some people hearing a story like this assume everyone else in the family must have suspected something. She didn't. She trusted her husband of 12 years the same way I trusted my wife of 4. That trust is exactly what Adam and Christine spent 2 years quietly exploiting. Sunday came. My parents' house sits on a quiet street near Fairview Park, the same house Adam and I grew up in, with the same dining table we'd eaten Sunday dinners at our whole lives. My mother had made a roast and green beans, completely unaware of what she was actually hosting. Nicole arrived with the kids, and I made sure this was the one thing I insisted on ahead of time: that Chloe and Max went straight into the back room to watch a movie once dinner was finished. Whatever was about to happen at that table, those 2 kids did not need to witness it. We ate. It was, without question, the most unbearable meal of my life. My mother asked Christine if she was feeling better from whatever bug she'd had earlier in the week. Christine managed a quiet yes, staring at her plate. My father made small talk about a football score. Adam barely touched his food. Chloe, 9 years old and blissfully unaware of what was coming, chattered about a school project on state history, and I remember forcing myself to actually listen and respond to her, because she deserved at least one adult at that table, giving her a normal conversation before everything around her changed. Max, 6, was more interested in his mashed potatoes than anything being said, which in hindsight felt like a small mercy. When my mother finally announced it was time for dessert, I caught her eye and gave the smallest shake of my head. She understood immediately and instead offered the kids a movie in the back room first so it doesn't get cold while we finish talking. Her voice admirably steady, given what she still didn't yet know was coming. Once the kids were settled in front of the television with the door mostly closed, I turned to my father. Dad, before everyone leaves tonight, there's something Adam and Christine need to tell you and Mom. The room went quiet in a way that felt physical, like the air pressure had changed. Adam tried the misreading a hug line first. I want you to understand how insulting that was, given what I'd walked in on 3 days earlier, given the 2 years Christine had already confessed to me in detail. He looked our father dead in the eye. Marcus is misreading a hug he saw, Dad. That's really all this is. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. A hug doesn't happen with both of you undressed in my bed in the middle of a Thursday afternoon. Tell them the truth or I will. And you already know I have more detail than you'd like me sharing at this table. My mother made a sound I had never heard her make before. My father's face went through about 4 different expressions in the space of 10 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, something that looked almost like physical pain settling into his jaw. And Nicole. Nicole just went completely still, not crying, not yelling. Still, in a way that scared me more than any amount of shouting would have. My father turned to Adam, his voice shaking in a way I'd genuinely never heard from him before. You're my son. He's your brother. How long did you think you could keep something like this hidden in a family this size? Adam stared at the tablecloth instead of at any of us. It wasn't supposed to go on this long. It kept not ending. That's not an answer. My father's voice was low, hard. That's an excuse dressed up as one. My mother reached over and gripped my hand under the table so hard it left a mark. She kept looking back and forth between Adam and Christine like she was waiting for one of them to say something that would make it make sense, some detail that would soften it. And neither of them ever did, because there wasn't one. How long? Nicole's voice was flat, controlled, aimed directly at Adam. Adam didn't answer. Christine did, quietly, finally telling the truth out loud with the whole family in the room. 2 years. Started with a work trip. She was sorry. It had gotten out of hand. She never meant for anyone to get hurt. The kind of sentence that means nothing once the hurt has already happened. My father stood up from the table so fast his chair nearly tipped over. I have never in 35 years seen him that angry. He didn't yell either, not really. He just looked at Adam, his voice barely recognizable. Get out of my house. Nicole didn't scream at Adam. She didn't throw anything. Didn't demand an apology in front of everyone the way I half expected. She stood up, walked to the back room, told Chloe and Max it was time to go, and left without another word to any of us. I found out much later that her silence wasn't shock. It was the beginning of something she'd already started building before that dinner even happened, though none of us knew it yet. I didn't know it yet, but Nicole had noticed something was off with Adam nearly 4 months earlier. Unexplained charges on a shared credit card. Evenings he couldn't account for. And she'd quietly started meeting with a divorce attorney of her own, on her own schedule, saying nothing to anyone. She hadn't known who the other woman was. She just knew something in her marriage had gone wrong, and she decided she wasn't going to be the last person in the room to find out the truth. That night, after Nicole and the kids left, and after my father told Adam and Christine both to leave his house, I sat at that dining table with my mother while she cried in a way I'd never seen her cry before. Not loud, just steady. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere very old. My father sat across from us, silent, staring at nothing. I don't understand how he could do that to his own brother. My mother's voice barely held together. I didn't have an answer for her. I still don't. Honestly, not one that makes any real sense. Some people just decide the people closest to them are the safest ones to hurt because they assume the relationship itself will absorb the damage. Adam was wrong about that. So was Christine. I drove home that night to a house I no longer wanted to live in. The following Monday morning, before I'd even had coffee, I called a family law attorney named Preston Ward, whose office was a few blocks from my job downtown. I sat in his office 2 days later, laid out the whole situation. No kids, a modest shared house, 4 years of marriage. And he told me plainly that this was about as uncomplicated a divorce as his office ever handled from a legal standpoint. The paperwork is simple, he told me. The rest of it usually isn't. Give yourself time for the rest of it. He was right. The paperwork took a matter of weeks. The rest of it took a lot longer than that. I didn't know it yet, but the next several weeks were going to bring far more consequences than I'd bargained for. Not for me, but for Adam and Christine, starting with a conversation my father had already begun having with his own estate attorney before that Sunday dinner had even finished clearing off the table. Here's something I didn't know about my father until all of this happened. He is a far more careful man than either of his sons ever gave him credit for. My parents had spent the better part of a decade slowly transferring pieces of the family hardware business, which they'd sold outright years earlier, but reinvested the proceeds into rental properties around the Tulsa area, into a family trust intended to pass to Adam and me equally when they were gone. It was never a secret. Adam and I both knew it existed. What we didn't know, because my father had never needed to explain the fine print to us, was that the trust included a standard morality and conduct clause his own estate attorney had insisted on years earlier. The kind of language most families never think twice about until a situation like this one forces the issue. Any beneficiary found to have caused, in the trustee's judgment, serious and deliberate harm to the family unit could be removed as a beneficiary by the surviving trustees. My father is the surviving trustee. My mother is the other. 3 weeks after that Sunday dinner, my father sat Adam down alone, without me in the room because he wanted to be fair about it, and told him he was invoking that clause. Adam would receive nothing from the trust. Not because my father wanted to punish him financially forever, he told me later, but because he needed Adam to understand, in a way that would actually cost him something, that what he'd done wasn't a private mistake between 3 adults. It had detonated an entire family, including 2 children who would spend the rest of their lives dealing with the fallout of a decision they had no part in making. Adam fought it, of course, hired a lawyer, tried to argue the clause was too vague to enforce. My father sat me down one evening a few weeks into it, over coffee at his kitchen table, and walked me through exactly why he'd never worried about that argument holding up. That clause was written 11 years ago. He turned his mug slowly in his hands. My attorney at the time said every family trust needs one, even if you never think you'll use it. I remember thinking it was a strange thing to plan for. Now I understand exactly why he insisted. You never thought it actually applied to one of us? No, I didn't. But I also didn't write it to apply to any one person. I wrote it. We wrote it to protect the family itself. Whatever that ended up meaning down the road. Turns out it meant this. The case never even made it to a real hearing. Adam's own attorney told him privately that the language was airtight and that pursuing it further would just cost him more money he no longer had, since Nicole's own attorney was, at the very same time, moving forward with the divorce and a request for the family home and primary custody of Chloe and Max. That's the part of this story I find the most satisfying, honestly. While Adam was busy trying to fight my father over money he'd lost through his own choices, Nicole's case moved forward almost quietly, almost gently, because she'd done her homework months before any of us knew there was homework to do. I found out the full extent of it much later from my mother, who'd stayed close with Nicole even after the divorces made most family gatherings awkward. Roughly 4 months before that Sunday dinner, Nicole had noticed a pattern of unexplained charges on a credit card she and Adam shared, a hotel a few miles from their own house. Charges for dinners on evenings Adam told her he was working late at the dealership. She hadn't known who the other woman was. She genuinely suspected for a while that it might be someone from his job, but rather than confront him outright and risk him covering his tracks better, she'd quietly started building a file. Bank statements, a calendar cross-referenced against his claimed work schedule, a first meeting with a divorce attorney on her own lunch break, telling no one, not even her own sister. I wasn't going to be the last person in my own marriage to find out the truth, she told my mother once, months after everything had settled. I'd already decided that whatever it turned out to be, I wasn't walking into it blind. By the time Sunday dinner happened and the truth came out in front of the whole family, Nicole already had a forensic accountant retained, already had documentation tracing exactly how much of their shared money had gone toward hotel rooms and gifts over 2 years. Money that legally belonged to their marriage and their children, not to whatever Adam had been quietly funding on the side. She didn't need dramatic confrontations or extra investigating once the truth was finally out in the open. She simply handed her attorney what she'd already built and let the process do the rest. By the time the dust settled that winter, Nicole kept the house near Fairview Park, kept primary custody, and Adam moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, seeing his kids every other weekend. He tried calling me a handful of times over those months. I answered exactly once, mostly out of habit, more than any real desire to hear what he had to say. I know I destroyed things. I never meant for it to go this far. You had 5 years, I told him, to not start something with my wife. You had 2 years to end it before I found out on my own. You didn't do either. So no, I don't think didn't mean for it to go this far means what you want it to mean. He was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. Do you think Dad will ever let it go? The trust? All of it? I think Dad built that trust to protect this family. You're the one who decided you weren't part of what needed protecting. That's not something I can undo for you, and honestly, I wouldn't if I could. You're my brother. His voice cracked slightly, like that fact alone should have counted for something after everything. I was. You spent 2 years deciding that didn't matter to you. I'm just the one who's finally agreeing with you. I hung up, and I haven't spoken to him since, other than the bare minimum required at our mother's insistence around a couple of holidays neither of us particularly wanted to attend. My divorce from Christine finalized that following spring on a quiet morning at the county courthouse downtown. There wasn't much to fight over. No kids, a modest house we sold and split according to what we'd each put into it. And honestly, by the time the paperwork was in front of us, neither of us had much fight left. We stood outside the courthouse afterward for a moment, both of us unsure what to say. I really am sorry, Marcus. I know that doesn't fix anything. No, it doesn't. But I believe you mean it. For whatever that's worth now, that was the last real conversation we had. She moved to Portland a few months later, according to my mother, who still occasionally hears from her out of some sense of old habit. I don't know what her life looks like now, and I've made peace with not knowing. I want to tell you about the last part of this story, because I think it's the part that actually matters most. For the first couple of months after that Thursday, I didn't do much besides work and sit in Jason's spare bedroom staring at the ceiling. Jason Whitaker had been my closest friend since high school, and he never once made me feel like a burden for crashing on his couch for 2 weeks while I figured out whether I could stand living in my own house again. He didn't offer advice most nights. He just made sure there was food in the fridge and didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. About 8 months after that Thursday afternoon, Jason talked me into coming to a barbecue at his place. Mostly, I think, because he was tired of watching me turn down every invitation he sent my way. That's where I met Megan Alvarez. She worked as a physical therapist at a clinic downtown, laughed easily, and had absolutely no connection to my family or the wreckage they'd left behind, which at that point in my life felt like its own kind of relief. We talked for most of that evening about nothing important, and I remember driving home afterward feeling something I hadn't felt in almost a year, mild, uncomplicated curiosity about another person. We didn't rush anything. I wasn't in any state to rush anything, and I told her that honestly, on our second date, laid out roughly what I'd been through without turning it into a performance of my own pain. She appreciated the honesty, she told me later, more than she would have appreciated me pretending I had nothing to work through. Over the following months, dinners turned into weekend hikes around Turkey Mountain, which turned into her meeting my parents, who liked her immediately, and I think needed a little bit of proof that something good could still grow out of everything that had happened. My mother told me once, near the end of that year, that watching Adam lose the trust in the family home hadn't given her any real satisfaction. What gave her comfort, she said, was watching me actually rebuild something honest instead of just being angry forever. I think about that Thursday afternoon more than I'd like to admit. The grocery bag hitting the floor. The sound from upstairs. My brother's face when he realized there was no explaining his way out of what I'd seen. I used to think the worst moment of my life was standing at the bottom of those stairs. Now I think it was actually the beginning of the only version of my life that turned out to be real. Chloe and Max are doing okay, from what I hear through my mother. Nicole has built a steady, quiet life for the three of them. Adam sees his kids on schedule and, according to my mother, has started actually showing up for it now that showing up is the only thing he has left. I don't know if that counts as growth or just consequences finally landing where they should have landed years ago. Maybe it's both. As for me, I bought a smaller house on the other side of Midtown last winter, closer to the park, far enough from the old house that I don't drive past it by accident anymore. Megan and I are talking about moving in together this year. My father still runs that trust with the same quiet, careful precision he always had, even when none of us realized it. A few weeks ago, my mother and I were clearing dishes after Sunday dinner, just the two of us in the kitchen while my father dozed in his chair in front of a game on television. She was quiet for a while, drying the same plate longer than it needed. "Do you ever wonder if we should have handled it differently?" she asked. "Quieter, maybe less public." I thought about that question honestly before I answered it. "No," I told her. "If we'd handled it quietly, Adam would still be telling himself it was a misunderstanding, and Nicole might still be wondering why the credit card statements never quite added up. Sometimes the loud way is the only way that actually ends it instead of just burying it." She nodded slowly, set the plate down, and didn't ask again. Every Sunday now, dinner happens at that same table near Fairview Park, minus one chair that used to be Adam's. And honestly, most days, none of us miss it being empty. Chloe and Max still come with Nicole every few weeks, still get spoiled by their grandparents the same as always. And if anyone at that table still thinks about the empty chair, nobody said so out loud in a long time.